So, welcome to this event from the CIPR Sports Network, the latest in our conversations with professionals of all backgrounds, members and prospective members, those working with sport, within sport, or with an interest in what can be learned from sport. I'm Scott Dougal. Joining me is Chris Haynes, a fellow vice chair of the CIPR Sports Network. Today, we're speaking to Aoife Clarke, the Director of Communications for the Irish Rugby Football Union. Aoife has recently made the journey from retail into sport after over 15 years with Lidl. And one of the things we'll be discussing with her is the differences between the two sectors. But her involvement in sport started a long time before that, including Lidl's support for women's sport in Ireland. We'll also get into that. Welcome, Aoife.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome indeed. As I mentioned in my intro there, Aoife, you've recently made um, the journey into sport from a corporate background. Um, I think one of the things we're interested in is what was the attraction of working in the sports industry?
I suppose I'm a huge sports fan. Grew up always in a very sporty household. Played not to any great heights myself, but played a wide range of sports growing up. The local rugby club was somewhere we spent a lot of time. My dad played there, and was volunteer coach and president at one point as well. So would have gone to a lot of games with him growing up. International fixtures. So yeah, I've always had a love of sport. Was a Leinster season ticket holder and would have travelled to events like Rugby World Cups and Lions tours as well. So for me, very much, I suppose, a dream job. And when I saw the role come up, although the timing wasn't great for me, I had a 3-week-old baby. I just felt that jobs like this don't come up that often. Ireland's quite a small place. So I said, look, I'd probably regret it if I didn't throw my hat in the ring. And yeah, nearly 2 years later, here I am.
And what's it been like moving from that sort of more corporate setting to working in sport? I mean, you touched on something there in terms of your dad had been a volunteer within sport, and I think that's something that's probably not well understood unless you know sport is how much volunteers contribute, for example.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's definitely other points for me. And I suppose even knowing what my dad did, I probably was still unprepared for the amount of volunteers, even on the professional side, in terms of like our union committees and, presidents and chairpersons and everything like that. I mean, the work that they do is phenomenal and all of them are unpaid volunteers. And, when I was preparing for my second interview, actually, I spoke to a previous union committee member who, and it's always kind of stuck with me. He said to me, I probably set aside, about 25 hours a week for my union committee work. And I was like, wow, that's 25 hours on top of a full-time job. So I suppose it's great, but I mean, the people who do it are the people who have a genuine love and an interest for the game and want to see it grow. So they're generally very easy to work with. But yeah, for me, that's probably one of the biggest lessons is the volunteers. So coming from a corporate world into sport, I suppose it was trying to understand all the stakeholders first and foremost, because they're obviously very different from retail, and then understanding strategy and objectives. I was quite fortunate that just before I officially started the role, so I had been named in position, but I was seeing out my maternity leave. The planning for the new strategic plan for the RFU had just started. So I did a couple of days sort of myself with the senior leadership team before I officially started. So I got great insight, I suppose, into the company and the way, the direction everything was going from the start. And so I was just really lucky that that sort of timing coincided with me starting as well, because it gave me great insight into the strategy and the objectives for the coming years. So yeah, that's kind of the main focus. I mean, like any job you would come into, there's a bedding in process and kind of getting to know the lay of the land. So from that point of view, it wouldn't be much different moving from company to company, but the volunteer aspect is probably the one that probably surprised me the most, to be honest.
Either every organization we engage with or talk to seems to have a slightly different structure or understanding what communication is, what it means. Could you describe how you see your role and remit in your organization?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, people probably see, the media side of it, so the rugby writers and the social channels. But for me, it's obviously much deeper than that. I mean, we cover the entire game. So I have quite a small team, but we're expected to cover all parts of the game from grassroots up. You know, we cover mixed ability rugby. We have a couple of hundred school kids in the Aviva today on an Aldi Play rugby program. So, you know, we cover all of that. And then there's the additional sort of like more corporate type inquiries of things that are happening, or, you know, we're publishing our financial statements or having our AGM. So it's, you know, I mean, it's everything. It's not just a national team togging out in a Six Nations. It's, I think people would have always seen, you know, there's a rugby season, whereas now, as the years have gone on, it's pretty much a 12-month calendar. You know, once something finishes, you're kind of on to the next. So the really defined seasons are definitely a thing of the past. And we're definitely finding that we're growing more. There's more teams coming in at different age grades. You know, we have under 20s, under 19s, under 18s, and yeah, there's so much work being done to develop the pathways. But then there's the whole grassroots game of people who just love rugby, and, you know, kids that are out there minis on a weekend as well. So it's really, really diverse, but that makes it really interesting as well.
The I also made a step from a corporate world literally overnight from the partner side to the rights holder side. And you know, it's interesting what you said about the different motivations when it comes to volunteers, because you're used to being in a place where everyone's on payroll, for example. But what you described there was the real complexity of a governing body. How do you compare that with the corporate world, where there can often be a simpler set of metrics or a simpler vision?
Yeah, I mean, as you kind of alluded to, I think one of the great things about sport is everyone sort of has the same objective. We're all striving for the same thing. We want the game to get better. You know, we want the teams to win. So, you know, everyone's pushing in the same direction. It definitely wouldn't have been the same in retail. You know, there was people there for various reasons, not because everyone had a burning desire for retail. So, I suppose it presents its challenges and opportunities with both. But I suppose sport, yeah, does give people that sort of singular aim and sort of that feeling of pride as well. So that probably makes it a little bit easier than the corporate world, where, you know, there's competing interests. You know, in the past, you know, commercial teams have one objective, but marketing teams have another objective to, you know, want to talk about something else. And people are like, well, you know, billboards about county players isn't going to sell milk. So, you know, and you're trying to sort of balance by saying, well, you know, it's building up a brand reputation for us. But, you know, it's hard when everything's comes back to exactly how much has gone through the tills, for example. So yeah, definitely challenging.
And a different kind of scrutiny that comes with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I suppose in sport, like rugby writers are there, like every journalist, they're there to do a job. They report on things, they criticize, they scrutinize, and everyone is just doing a job. There's probably more of an emotional investment when it comes to sport, because it's a national team and it's winning and losing, and it's all of those things. I think what I find probably the biggest change is social media, and maybe it's just, again, as the years have gone on, it's become a lot more toxic, but definitely I've never seen anything like the levels I see when it comes to you know, toxic commentary online. Not just from media, but from obviously members of the general public as well, when it comes to sporting people, and just how personal it is as well. You know, I suppose being in a retailer, you're just penned as the retailer, whereas, you know, in sport, it can just go, well, that person missed the kick or that person got sent off and that's why we lost. So it's a lot more targeted and a lot more personal.
But that sort of personal attack is leadership and athlete, male athletes, female athletes. And how do you manage that and deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just try to be as open and transparent as possible when you can. There's no point in shying away from it. I mean, we do media, we're obliged to do a certain amount of media for certain tournaments, but, you know, I always feel like there's more we can be doing. But I think one of the things we try to do a lot more now is using our own channels to speak directly to fans as well, and show glimpses of things that people wouldn't see. You know, all the work that goes in behind the scenes as well. So we try to sort of engage our fans that way by kind of using players in a lot of content, and just trying to, you know, I suppose there's, as the way communications has gone as well, there's a whole generation that will probably never pick up a paper to read any sort of match previews, but they still want to know about their favorite players. They want to know what teams are thinking or how they're preparing. So it's trying to, I suppose, match different channels to different kind of age groups as well, and make sure that we're providing as much information as we can for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Aoife, because I think one of the things you've talked about there is the passion people have for sport, and that comes out in good ways in terms of people volunteering a huge amount of their time for free, but it also comes out in negative ways and sometimes on social media. But I also, listen to what you're saying about the very, very fine margins that retailers operate on, and how little room for error there is there. I mean, what do you think the sports sector can learn from how the corporate world uses communications?
Um, I suppose in sports, you can get into a bubble. It can be very sort of like just focused on that tournament, and everything is kind of on that moment, or it's on that game, and people exist in that bubble and there's nothing else outside of it. Um, for me, I suppose one of the things I said when I came into this role is rugby writers are always going to write about rugby. We don't need to work that hard with them, and that's no offense to them, but they're always going to come to press conferences. There's so many other places we can talk about rugby. We can talk about the benefits of playing sport, with lifestyle media. We can build up our players as role models, so we can feature them, in magazines or in places that they wouldn't usually be seen, because, they're people are interested in things that they do and what they eat. We can talk about the best nutritionists that we have. We can talk about the best teams we have when it comes to getting players back from injury. So another example is, I suppose, my CEO is doing a business interview this week, and it's his second one now. And I don't think an IRFU CEO had ever done a business interview. They'd always spoken to rugby media, but they were never talking about the business of sport and the challenges that we have, from a financial sense and everything that's going on globally. So it's important for me that we take those opportunities to be in other spaces as well, and not just focus on the sports bubble. So I suppose that's something I was able to bring in, because I've had that experience in Lidl where I covered communications and CSR and corporate as well. I think insights on reputation, it's probably front of mind for me, because just yesterday the Ireland Rep Track rankings came out, and I was at a presentation. So the IRFU is the highest ranking national governing body in the country. So we're far ahead of the Gaelic Athletic Association, the GAA, and also the Football Association of Ireland, who cover soccer. So there's a huge amount of learning for me there. I sent a note around to my senior leadership team and also to the union committee with some of the points. We actually ranked #1 for leadership out of the 100 companies survey. So, that was really important to say, look, the public really respect us and what we do. Where we ranked really highly on conduct, because we're seen as being quite open and transparent. So there's a lot we can learn from those broader themes. And as I always say, kind of, I want to bring the RFU onto the front pages for the right reasons, and not just the back pages. And I think probably something as well is, I think in sport you can fall into working with a lot of people for prolonged periods of time, because it's like they're part of the family. You hear that a lot. Or, well, they're sort of embedded with the team now, whereas I kind of favor more of a professional approach in terms of like tendering out services to make sure that we're always doing the best, and getting the best that we can. So that's something I've not been afraid to do either, is sort of change things up there, or bring some services in-house if I think they're better suited as well. So it's probably just, yeah, I suppose as much as I love rugby, I wouldn't be as emotional maybe about it as other people would be. So I can kind of stand over it sometimes and look in with a different eye and say, look, that might be really nice. And we might have always done things that way, but times have changed and we need to move on as well.
When you get a great moment like that and an accolade like that, I mean, two things. Firstly, what do you think are the contributing factors to being seen as having that reputation? And secondly, how do you use it with stakeholders to put a bit of wind in the sails or pump out the chest?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we ranking #1 out of the 100 for leadership is really good. And I suppose that's not just a CEO, that's just not those people. I mean, that's Andy Farrell, that's Scott Beamond, that's David Humphreys, that's all of the management and sort of visible leadership figures that we have. Like I think we'll be honest as well, performance on the field probably has a huge part to play. So if you're doing well, I mean, I suppose if I just compare it really basically, our soccer team doesn't qualify for that many big tournaments, but Ireland, we have a Six Nations every year. We're in a Rugby World Cup. So people just kind of go, oh, they're doing really well. They're in a Rugby World Cup. And, so yeah, I think that probably helps. I think we're well run. We're quite transparent when it comes to our finances. Touch wood, there haven't been sort of any big scandals to do with sort of governance. When Sport Ireland mandated that governing bodies needed to have a 40% gender balance, we were the first to move as quickly as possible and get that done. So we tend to kind of not sort of drag our feet on anything, and we just kind of, whatever we need to change, we change. I think probably the fact that we sell out all our home games gives that feeling as well that, it's an organization that's doing really well. I mean, we still have our challenges like everybody else. We're a not-for-profit. We still need so much more money to invest in the game. We're really lucky to have amazing sponsors and partners that we do have, but we want to elevate, I suppose, the women's game in particular, and we need investment for that. So it's not without its challenges, but I suppose the better a reputation we have, the more likely sponsors and everything will want to be with us. Potentially we can unlock more government funding because we're trusted to spend it properly. So it's important for all of those things.
And you, the that perspective in terms of how you are perceived by um, current and prospective commercial partners is a really interesting part of it because I think the risk in sport is you do get caught up in it. Is the team doing well? Therefore, the organisation as well. And the problem with that, of course, is that performance can do it down as well as up. But moving beyond that, do you think uh, commercial partners are more interested in the corporate reputation than the on-field reputation of governing bodies, and they're given credit for, perhaps? But yeah,
I wouldn't say it's more important, but it's definitely becoming increasingly important. And I think probably like sustainability and all those topics will sort of come to the fore as well. So yeah, I wouldn't say it dictates everything, but I suppose they want to know that we're an organization that's well run, that we're spending money that people give us really wisely, we're investing it in the right places, we're doing right by the game. So yeah, like I mean, everyone loves success and trophies, but equally you want to have a partner that is really good to work with and that is kind of doing things really well. So if they probably go hand in hand. I wouldn't think that one of them sort of outweighs the other.
great. And I think one of the things you've touched on there, and I know this was part of your career before you moved into rugby, is women's sport. And I suppose my question is really, where do you see the challenges there, and what role do you think communications has in solving those?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's not a single women's sport in the country that couldn't do with more money, could do with more visibility, could do with better broadcast. So it's a challenge for everyone. In Lidl, when we took on ladies Gaelic football back in, I want to say it was like 2015 or 2016. Um, it was our first foray into a big sponsorship. We had dabbled with a couple of events here and there, but this was the first big thing. And I always kind of remember us talking about it, and we had a couple of things on the table that we were looking at, and this was one of them. And we were debating, I suppose, the pros and cons between all the various ones. And with ladies Gaelic football, it was like it felt really right because we were like, we know the majority of people who do the shopping are women. It's a women's, there's people who will have played it as a kid that will have stopped, or there's mums of girls or boys even playing, Gaelic football that will resonate with it. But the one thing I felt quite strongly about at the time was I didn't want it to be a charity, like a charity or a token sort of initiative, like, oh, aren't we great giving money to women's sport? If we're going to do it, we need to do it properly. And I had a good few friends who would have played GAA. I remember speaking to them and I was like, like what could a sponsor do? What could somebody like Lidl do? And it was really basic things for them. It was like, helping us get kits, helping us, for snacks after training. And, that was all things we could do as a retailer. So, we ran initiatives in clubs, where it's like, when you shop in Lidl, get a stamp, and when your club collects 500 stamps, you'll get a free set of kits. So all of that stuff was just so powerful. But yeah, I think, that's what women's sport needs. They need sponsors and they need partners to come in, not just to throw money or put up a sign somewhere or put a logo on a jersey. They need actual support to activate stuff on the ground. Um, yeah, and I mean, I think there is still a lot of lip service. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, women's sport is really important, but I don't think there's enough brands actually putting their hand in their pocket to pay for things. A lot of the time they're like, oh, we'll put it alongside the men's, but it's like, no, like it deserves to have more. I really hope that, I suppose, the Rugby World Cup being in England this year is a real watershed moment. It's as close as we'll get to a home World Cup. So I'm really hoping that sort of, piques brands' interest as well. Because the team is going well at the moment. But I think we still need more. We need more media. I can tell you there's probably half the numbers come to a women's Six Nations media session than a men's. But who's going to force that? Who's going to also say to media, you have to give as much broadcast time to women's sport as you do men's? I get frustrated sometimes. I turn on the sports news and it's all the men's sport, and then at the end it's like, oh, and Ireland women played. I'm like, we're a women's national team. If you're talking about the men's national team, women should be straight after it. And if you're talking about provinces, then they should follow after it. So my provincial colleagues won't thank me for that. But, I think there's a ranking there. But yeah, so I mean, that's a societal change. That's up to people to do. And, even like people are like, we have huge numbers that turn out for men's rugby who claim to love rugby and are Irish rugby fans, but we don't get the same numbers that come out for women's games. And why is that? So we do need big moments in women's sport. And hopefully the likes of, as I say, a strong performance in a Rugby World Cup will help that. But equally, I think it's coming back to people as well, kind of actually sitting down and saying, look, okay, I need to get out and support women's sport. I need to turn up. I'm fond of kind of saying, if every single person who piled on the RFU a couple of years ago when women's rugby was in a bad place turned up to our games, we'd be selling out the Aviva Stadium. So like, where are all those people who cared about rugby then? So sorry, probably on my soapbox a bit there with
Right.
that one.
No, no,
So
I think you make an excellent point. People are very quick to criticize, but not quick to turn out sometimes,
yeah.
definitely.
I think what's really interesting to articulate there is the power of a commercial partner to fuel, drive, provide focus, activate when they work hand in hand with the governing body, and it's the purpose when it's an authentic purpose. And that's the difference between a sponsor and a great partner for a sport, isn't it? It's interesting you made that step between the two.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the key word is probably partner. Like we generally refer to them as
Yeah,
partners because that's
yeah,
what they are. We're both getting something from it.
yeah.
Anyone who's just like, look, I just want to come in and throw up a billboard or stick a logo on somewhere, they're not that interested in the game. They just want the visibility. So, you want brands and companies that are really want to do more and want to kind of activate. So they're the kind of key ones I think that women's sport needs.
And I was interested there as well. You talk about societal role and societal change, and how often, I suppose, the wider public makes sense of many things that are about society through sport before they do through other areas, whether it's safeguarding gender, all sorts of different issues. So I guess those are things that you're often dealing with the complexity of.
As well, and I suppose you kind of bring it back if you look at kids, often you kind of say kids don't see race or they don't see differences. They don't, they're so innocent. And you see kids who come to Ireland women's games and they are just like blown away because they're like, oh my God, I'm at an Ireland game. And our girls spend so much time afterwards going around signing jerseys and things, and kids are amazed. And sometimes you'll hear a kid going, but why isn't it full? Like, why isn't it like a men's game where there's like, why is there loads of empty seats? So hopefully, there is a generation that maybe that are going to women's sports at a really young age and will keep with that. I think it's really important for parents to bring kids to sports, as much as possible to kind of see and sort of give that lead as well. So yeah, I that's something I suppose I feel quite passionately about.
And when you look at, let's say, the Ireland international women's team and the men's team, do you think of the same common tools and the same ways of doing things, or are you looking at slightly different audiences and therefore use different combination of channels?
Completely different audiences, I'd
Mm.
say. and the way we approach our comms would be different. People for some reason want to know, they want to see a bit more personality. I think our men's game is just so professional, and week in, week out with their provinces, with Munster and Leinster and Connacht and Ulster, they're doing media and they've almost become desensitized to it. It's the same sort of answers. You probably see it across other sports. Whereas the women's team, they're a bit more, I suppose, engaging. It's all still quite new to them. They're a lot younger as well. Some of our key players are kind of early 20s, whereas, it's kind of more later 20s. I suppose that some of the men are kind of coming into their prime. So they're a lot more fresh, I suppose. They give opinions on things, they have a laugh, they're willing to talk about themselves and their personalities and their struggles and everything that's kind of gone on. So I do find as well, like, media seem to kind of look a bit more for like the personal angles, what's gone on in their life, and they're quite willing to talk about it. We've had players who've spoken about abuse that they've suffered in the past, traumas that they've been through, with parents passing. So there's probably that. I mean, I think a lot of the content we try to do with the women's team as well is a bit more personality driven. So experimenting with doing things, like hearing their favorite songs. We want to hear as well, what products they use. The girls want to know what tan they put on the night before a game, and what are their must-haves in that area. So yeah, it's completely different. And I suppose we're doing more social content probably to make up for
Yeah.
the lack of traditional media exposure that they're getting, in the hope that, I suppose, the other will follow in time. And if we can build their profiles and build their personalities as well, then if we can find an Alona Maher, for example, in a women's team that will help sort of capture that attention, then that's great as well. So
It seems I can think of sports where it seems on the women's side there's almost a better connection to participation than the need to drive participation. And people talking about the benefits of getting involved in sport. I'm thinking across rugby and football and cricket. Whereas on the more established commercialized men's side, that seems to be sort of more difficult to be part of the conversation.
yeah, I think so. I suppose like the men's game has just been, I suppose you have to think as well, like the men's game has been professional for since the early 90s. The women's game has only become professional in the last few years. So I mean, if you were to sort of like mirror the timelines, that we're probably going through a lot of what the men's game suffered with in those early days. Obviously, completely different times in terms of completely different media landscape. So, but I suppose with the men's game, it's always been quite obvious the route to a professional career, whereas with the women's, it hasn't. So maybe that sort of opened it up as well, because there are people who are juggling careers alongside a career in high performance sport. Now that's more and more changing. What we're seeing now is we have 37, I think, on a centralized program that are training full time in our high performance center. So less and less, I suppose, they're studying, or they're probably combining studies, but they're not in professional careers. There's a handful of them, I think there's two or three I can think of, who are in full-time jobs that just have the flexibility to take chunks off for big tournaments. So yeah, it is completely different, and I suppose we recognize the difference and we need to champion that, and we need to find ways to celebrate both of them as well, in an equal manner, because I suppose any exposure for rugby hopefully elevates every part of the game. So when the men's team is doing well, hopefully we can use some of that attention to get other messages out there as well.
And just from a governing body point of view, and what you were speaking about earlier, Aoife, in terms of corporate reputation, one of the things that when we were thinking about interested people we could talk to, the reason your name came up is that the Irish rugby seems to have gone on a bit of a journey with regards to its support for the women's side of the sport, and is now um, perceived as being an organisation which is doing much better on that front. It, are you able to talk through the journey that has involved? Like what were the steps that you took for that?
Yeah, so I suppose I'm coming up to 2 years in the job, so everything that kind of happened was pre me. So I suppose I was probably reading about it like as a fan, or as a spectator. But women's rugby, I suppose historically across all unions was separate to the men's game. So there was a previous, like they were a separate union up until I think it was 2006 when they joined the IRFU then. So the Irish Women's Rugby Football Union became part of the IRFU. Um, but I suppose when it came in, it wasn't treated the same as the men's game because it wasn't professional. There was no provincial structure. The pathways just weren't there. So it's playing a lot of catch up. And I suppose there's a lot of, I suppose, probably biases that were there. So I mean, ultimately, the women's national team had a couple of really good years. I think they won a Grand Slam in like 2013 or 14, and they had some really good years, and then they kind of slipped off the radar. They then didn't qualify for the last Rugby World Cup, but that was probably like a huge watershed moment there, where I suppose it really woke up the union to say, like, we can't let this happen again. And there was letters written to the government from, a number of former players and current players, some players that we still have today who had signed the letter, who said, they had no faith in the IRFU to manage the women's game. But I suppose a leadership change came then. So Kevin Potts came in as CEO, and sort of he made his big mandate the women's game. I don't think he'll mind me saying when I met him. So I went through 2 rounds of interviews before I met Kevin. And the only topic I talked to Kevin about was women's rugby before I got the job. So I knew that he was really taking it very seriously. So I suppose I didn't start the job until July of 23, but it was the 2023 Six Nations where they really had hit rock bottom. So they were wooden spoon, they lost every game. There was a lot going on online with, kind of supporters club accounts that were like, aggressively targeting the IRFU, and just it seemed to have been a really, really dark place, I suppose. And I knew I was coming into the job. I was actually on the other side of the world, in Australia, visiting my partner's family with our baby, and it was like every morning I woke up and was like, oh my God, what's happened overnight? I was, what am I going into? So I started in July 23. In the same day that I started, there was a culture lead who started. So the first thing they did was they brought in a culture lead to sort of really start from the ground up with the women's team. And then there was a new coaching team appointed. So Scott Beamond came in, a former Red Roses coach. So it was, I suppose, a bit of a reset. And I sort of took the same approach with the women's team. I approached a lot of them individually and said, look, I'm new. I'd really like to understand, the challenges that you guys face and what you think we could do better as a team. So, they spoke to me and they were great. They were so honest and direct about the challenges that they faced. They were like, we don't get the same support that the men do. We don't ever have consistent resourcing. I think probably what had just happened in the Six Nations, there was a lot of firefighting. They felt like they were always being targeted. I suppose they felt that the same people did media all the time, that there wasn't a lot of rotation. So in their mind, certain players that maybe fitted a better narrative got all the speaking time. So, that was something for me, was okay, we need to democratize a bit more and give people opportunities. So we tried to be really balanced in what we do now and make sure that, we share out sort of requests for podcasts or media interviews and, anything around games that we can. So I suppose that direct engagement has really helped. So build a bond with the team, but it came at a good time because everything else, there's a massive reset across the organization. So then obviously you're helped by the fact that the team start performing on the field. So they went from a 2023 Six Nations finishing bottom to finishing third in the 24 Six Nations and qualifying for the Rugby World Cup at the same time. So I suppose there was a huge amount of pressure lifted then, because that was the big aim, was to get qualified for a Rugby World Cup. And, they've gone on since then. They beat New Zealand, the reigning world champions, at a competition last October in Vancouver as well. So yeah, there's been a huge focus within the organization as well. Like, we've brought in a head of women's strategy now, who started in January, who's our most capped former player, Lynn Cantwell. So there's a huge focus, I suppose, on the women's game now. It gets the priority that it deserves. And it's still growing. There's so much resourcing going into the area, and we're constantly being challenged to do more for them as well. So it's great. It's all sort of thankfully kind of come together, but there's still a lot of challenges within the game. As I said earlier, we need a lot more investment to kind of supercharge it. And so that's going to be probably one of our biggest challenges over the coming years.
I'm hearing the joy of momentum,
Yes.
and that great feeling when there is momentum. whilst being ready for how quickly that can change in sport. But also really struck there by that you're talking about a reset, the link between vision, leadership, culture, and how communication can shape that and drive that, and the critical role of communication. But communication alone without those other elements, yeah, I think that was a
Yeah,
leading.
so I don't think girls would mind me saying, but they had this mantra themselves that they developed as a team, and it's called Green Wave. And it was really powerful for them, and it's all about, the green waves that are off the coast of the Atlantic in Ireland, and it's one of the most powerful waves. But a wave comes and there's more waves, so you kind of get up and you go again. So that sort of was their mantra, and that was what was guiding them internally. And I kind of then said to them at one point, would you like to talk about this externally at some point? And they said, look, we're not there yet, but we're at that point now where you'll start to see them talk about Green Wave and, in some post-match interviews or in things that they're doing. So it's very much me then helping them sort of talk about what's really special to them and, sort of try to bring the public into that as well. And we're hoping to do that, over the next few months as well in the lead up to Rugby World Cup. I
That's
think,
very
sorry, that's probably one huge difference as well between the women and the men's game. The women are so much more inquisitive and they ask so many questions like, why are we doing this? Or why do we do this media? Or what's the point of this? Whereas I suppose in the men's game, they do it maybe week in, week out with their provinces. It's what they do, but we get questioned all the time. Maybe it's just, women are a lot more inquisitive in general and ask a lot more questions. But I find that really refreshing. I think it's brilliant when they want to know, because once they know, they're so much more engaged. They're like, oh, okay, I get it. I understand why we're doing it now. They're kind of ready to go.
And it sounds like the initial dialogue you had with the team, Aoife, when you were asking them about what they wanted to see done, um, that gave you the opportunity when the team when performances did improve, that gave you the opportunity to talk about that in a quite credible way, really, I suppose. And I think the idea of um, bringing team culture to the fore, and if it comes from them, it's just so much more authentic, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I suppose I've been on the rights holder side, and you sit in a room with agencies and you come up with campaigns, and generally it's great. They sit in a room and they come out and they're lovely. But I was like, this is something that's actually really real, and it's really powerful. So why wouldn't we talk about it? Because the girls feel so passionately about it. And I think that word that you mentioned, like authentic, it's really authentic to them. It's not me feeding them something saying,
Oh.
Here's the line we'll get out there. Here, this will sound really good on social media. So, it's something that they've generated and they're really proud of themselves. So, naturally they want to talk about it then.
And one of the topics we talk about within the CIPR Sports Network, Aoife, is um, the challenges facing women within communications roles, and you've spoken about how you were coming back from maternity leave when you took the job at the Irish Rugby Football Union, um, and it's difficult to know where the biggest problems are to solve within comms, but it does feel like there's some rungs missing in the ladder, if you like, and I know from talking to colleagues that maternity is one of those big concerns, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I went on maternity leave from Lidl in October 2022. So my son was born in November 22, and I applied for the job in the RFU in December 22, not really kind of thinking too much about it, just going, look, I don't let the opportunity pass. So I spent, time in January interviewing, and I suppose Ireland is so small. I kind of just assumed, I'm sure, somebody in the RFU knows I'm on maternity leave. Like, it's a small industry, it's a small country. And I knew, I suppose, kind of going through the process, I was like, oh, by the time the process is through, I'll be kind of halfway through my statutory maternity period, which is 6 months in Ireland, and I have a 3 month notice period. So, if I needed to, I could probably start a job at 6 months, even though childcare is a real problem in Ireland. I had a crash, but they wouldn't take the baby till he was a year old. So, but I'm very much one of those people that I'm like, I'll deal with something when I need to deal with it. And as I went through the process and then got offered the job, and they were like, oh, just checking, do you think you could get out of your notice period a bit earlier and start? And I was like, well, actually, I've I've actually got a 10-week-old baby, so I don't think that's going to be possible. And I have to say they were just so fantastic. They, the RFU straight away said, look, um, you tell us when you want to start, like no pressure, you just tell us the
Oh,
start date. So I was really lucky, I suppose, to have a very supportive family. So my mum stepped in to mind the baby for a couple of months before he started creche. So I started work when he was about 8 or 9 months old. And I suppose because it was coming up to the Men's Rugby World Cup in 2023, and I was like, these type of things only happen every 4 years, so I'd hate to miss out on it. And also, I would have been traveling to games as a fan anyway, so I was like, even better to be traveling as part of work. So yeah, but there is, I mean, it's challenging, I suppose. A lot of the burdens do fall on women. Childcare, as I said, in Ireland is a huge issue. So many creches don't take babies till they're a year old, but not everyone can afford to take a year off work when, statutory maternity only covers you for 6 months, and your employer probably, if you're lucky, tops that up as well. So yeah, there's definitely challenges around that. I think, even having better paternity leave that, it could be shared, that you could have a partner that could take a number of months off, and actually encouraging men to do that, because there's a huge amount of men that have that don't take it for the exact reason that they don't want it to harm their careers, yet their partner has to take it. So yeah, but I mean, I was really lucky. The RFU is a very flexible place to work. Obviously there's key times where you've a run of Six Nations games and it feels like every weekend is taken up, but women's games in particular, like my son comes to all of them. He runs around in captain's runs, like all the girls know him, he's high-fiving them. So it's lovely to have, be able to kind of bring them to things like that as well. So yeah, it's been brilliant for me. I think I probably would have found it a lot more challenging going back maybe into the corporate world, because of the way I worked there. Whereas, I live relatively close to the high performance center for the RFU, so I can go up there to work. I can come over to the office, but sport, I suppose, with the nature of a lot of it being on weekends, sometimes you can kind of claw a bit of time back during the week, which helps as well.
And you
sorry,
talk
go on, Chris.
about I think I hear very loudly the supportive organization and the supportive network you have in your life around you. And then while sport can be all encompassing, never stop, evenings and weekends, but within that you build the team and have the flexibility to be able to do what you need to do and get respite.
Yeah, absolutely. Like last year, because it was my first year, and because I was doing so much of the women's team, I really wanted to spend as much time with them. And I kind of wanted to understand what it was like in a tournament as well, how frantic it is and how intense and what it's like in that bubble. So I traveled with the women's team for all of their away games last year, which was two, but I went with them when they went on team travel, whereas generally, I could just go to a match if I wanted to, or travel to a match, but I went with them for the days beforehand. So that for me was really important, to kind of understand the dynamics of how everything works. But then this year, for example, I was able to say, look, I'm just going to fly over to Edinburgh for the day and go to a game. I didn't need to travel and take 4 days away. So that's really helpful, I suppose, and that I have that flexibility, that I can kind of choose what I need to go to and what I don't need to go to, is really helpful. But then still maintain a presence, I suppose, and show leadership and show that interest across the game. So, whether you're kind of going to a club finals or popping up to the Aviva to a kids' day that's on, it's nice to be able to sort of like get around to everything as much as you can.
I've in this conversation, I love that image of the green wave and the way that you spoke about it and where it came from. Because when it comes from the players, how much more impact it has. The way you described it was beautiful. I'm also really struck in this conversation that I've been mispronouncing the name of a famous retail organization for quite some time.
Do you know, it's so funny because in the UK they have changed their ads to say Lidl, because they were like, everyone just says Lidl, nobody says Lidl. But the official
Okay.
German pronunciation is Lidl. So yeah, but it's so funny how often in Ireland people would have said to us, you're pronouncing it wrong. And we're like, no, it's the UK, they're pronouncing it wrong. So they did change their advertising because they were like, they just gave up.
I love a situation where I can be right even though I'm wrong. I think that's great.
Yeah,
I love that.
yeah.
This it's we could talk for a long time. It's fascinating, and that move from let's call it from a business to a bubble, and actually the way that you talk about the similarities rather than the differences. I'm struck by the way you talked about the power of partnerships and it becomes such a natural move and a really focused move to be in Little Lidl, and then the RRFU. Interesting talking about the women's sport and the differences in the way that women are project themselves and the channels they use, but also the different audiences and different mix of audiences you're trying to talk to in that space. I think it's easy for people to look at sport, and often a world where it's measured by money and medals, and to think that reputation is all about, or what you do is all about performance and all about the media. But actually, the brilliant way you explain the complexity and the range of different things that build reputation. And then I've been really struck by the way you talk about the momentum that you have whilst being poised to know that you need to keep pushing in that direction. It's not luck, and that it comes through the role of communication around leadership and culture and common messaging and a grown-up organization. And I think therefore you've done brilliantly is run this idea that this is business and this is sport, the similarities and the transferable aspects between the two. So I found that absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, no, it is. I have to say, like, work is work and communications is communications. But I've been really fortunate. Like, I loved working in retail. And for me, and I mean, I suppose most people want to work for something they're passionate about, but I could never be as motivated to work in certain areas like a finance or insurance because it's just not, I don't have an interest, I tune out. That doesn't float my boat at all. So like I loved retail, I loved the diversity of everything that went on there. But for me now, the opportunity to work in a sport that I absolutely love is, like I'm still pinching myself, nearly 2 years on that I actually get to come in here every day.
Great. Thank you, Aoife, and thank you so much for being such a brilliant guest on this. It's really, really appreciated. So I typically wrap these up by asking a Kirsty Young style question, which is if you could go back and talk to yourself when you were beginning a career in communications, what advice would you give yourself?
Um, I think to be honest, like taking risks and not being afraid to put yourself out there, has always benefited me. It's sort of how I got some of my early career moves, I suppose, was not being afraid. People talk about imposter syndrome a lot. I mean, for me, even this job with the IRFU, in my head, I was like, oh, there's loads of people working in sport who'd be way more qualified than me. But you kind of then have to go, no, but you know what? I have a lot I can bring as well. So I would say that to younger people is take the chance. And I don't know, I probably feel really old saying something like this, but like I feel like there's a whole generation that like don't want to work for free or work hard. But for me, I volunteered to work at events. I went to a couple of events companies because that's what I was interested in straight after I came out of college. I was doing an events and PR postgrad, and I was like, I want to get experience working at events, I'll work for free. And then I ended up getting a job actually doing the corporate hospitality, ironically, for the IRFU. So it was, and for me that was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I get to go and work at the games now. So it was yeah, and I was just like, I put myself out there. I was like, I'm willing to do the hard work. So I think, if you're able to, if you're in communications, like go vol and you want to get into sports, but it's a hard industry to break into, for example, go and volunteer at a local club and help do, be their PRO, and hopefully find a way to sort of get experience and gain contacts. And I think networking is invaluable as well. And I remember doing a course years ago where it was like they gave us like these cards and it was like there's 10 people you need in your network. You don't want everyone that's like, oh no, what you're doing is right. You want someone who challenges you, someone who thinks differently. And it was great because you were forced to kind of sit down and say, right, who are those 10 people who can help me with this? So like go to events, join CIPR and in Ireland, the Public Relations Institute, like and go and meet people and gain as much experience, I suppose, and exposure as you can at a young age, because you never know, they're small worlds and you never know what kind of opportunities will come up. So like kind of putting yourself out there, I suppose you're putting yourself across people's radars.
Definitely, I think put yourself out there because what's the worst that can happen, right? And
Yeah.
as my granny would say, shy Ben's getting out. So I think that's fantastic advice. Aoife Clark, thank you so much again for doing that. That was really, really appreciated. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for having me.